So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rosie, and thank you very much for coming. This is a sort of a panel which is an embarrassment of riches, and I've got these painful speaker bios, and I just don't know what to do with them because it could take like half an hour to read them out. So I'm going to do it fast and in a slightly abbreviated way, with apologies to the panel because I'll leave out like half their awards and whatever. So, Indy, when I say your name, wave. There we go, there's Indy. Is a founding director of 00 and Dark Matter Labs. He's an architect, senior innovation associate at the Young Foundation, visiting professor at the University of Sheffield, co-founded Impact Hub Birmingham and Open Systems Lab, member of the RSA's Inclusive Growth Commission. That's enough. Okay, Mark, academic political strategist, speechwriter, inaugural director of the UCL Policy Lab, previously director of the Sydney Policy Lab at University of Sydney, CEO of the New Economics Foundation, professor of political theory at Oxford. I'm stopping. That's Mark. Chris Ann, wave. CEO of We Belong, the UK's first migrant youth-led organisation. Together with young refugees and migrants, We Belong aims to improve individual lives and win systemic change. She secured a major change in the law to ensure young migrants can access student finance. She was appointed an Eisenhower Fellow Youth Leader, trustee for the Queen's Commonwealth Trust. I'm stopping. Martha. She's the executive director of the Civic Power Fund and helped convene today and played a very important role in doing so, so thank you. The UK's first fund dedicated to community organising. Until January this year, she was the head of global humanitarian advocacy at UNICEF. Prior to that, she led teams in winning campaigns at Shelter and Save the Children. She's a trustee of Oxfam UK, and I'll stop. So this is a really wonderful august panel who are unusually well placed to tackle tonight's question. So by way of introduction, I think all of us, every one of us at the Conduit feels simultaneously pessimistic and optimistic about the future. All of the world's big systemic challenges, climate, economic inequality, racially disparate outcomes on every possible level, the oppression of women, the rise of populism, the increase of global conflict, you name the kind of litany of woes for which Nouriel Roubini is coming tomorrow morning at 10 to tell us about his book, Mega Threats. All of those problems, I think we all thought for a while that liberal, constitutional democracies with bills of rights and separation of powers and fairly contested electoral systems would take the best ideas, distill them down, the people with the best ideas would win, and we would have a system of governance which would pendulum between different political tendencies, and we would all govern in a wise and semi-benevolent way, even if the group of people who you didn't like were in power. Who of you are feeling like, oh, that's really didn't happen? And it didn't happen, and I think we all now feel that the political systems that we have are not fit for purpose, don't correspond to the challenges that the world is currently facing, and have some way being captured or co-opted in ways that are unpalatable and difficult. And so tonight's panel is broadly assembled in order to try and tackle that problem, to try and say, how do we reimagine and redesign our political systems to get them to respond to this set of existential challenges? And so we're going to do a few things tonight. We're going to try and be as specific and as practical as possible to say, how might you reimagine political systems to do that? We're going to talk about it in the case of the UK, because we're here and it offers us a kind of live laboratory experiment. There is a very fortuitous, somewhat coincidental piece of timing that a major report was released in the last 24 hours. It happens to be a Labour report co-authored by Gordon Brown, broadly endorsed by Keir Starmer, which we'll talk about because I think it's relevant. And then we're going to spend some time saying, if this is the critique and how might you do it, how might you apply it in the UK, what are the best ideas that are applicable in the UK right now, and then how might you actually get from the ideal state that we're imagining to that in real terms from the current system to a new system practically. If we can achieve that tonight, I think we should give ourselves the Nobel Prize. So that's the goal. So I think I'm going to start with you as the sort of convener. And I'd like to start by asking, what are the kind of specific design changes that you would propose to the current system that you think would be responsive to the preamble that I've just given on the assumption that you agree with it?
Can you all hear me? Is that working? Great, thank you. I'm going to slightly dodge the question and say that there are some specific things that I would say and the Civic Power Fund would say that we need to have adjacent to our democracy in order to make it function much better. And we, as a fund, we focus specifically on community organising. Now, community organising is a practice that is pretty unique in its capacity to build the power of ordinary citizens and win change that matters to them. But in doing so, really kind of build and deepen relationships between those citizens and also create institutions that are much more accountable to its people. And for us, we think that's one of the big sort of missing pieces in UK democracy, that we have institutions that are incredibly centralised, very, very divorced from the very real needs and wants of communities, and communities that are already feeling left behind because of who they are or where they are from, are feeling that even more, and that kind of disenfranchisement from democracy is becoming even more entrenched. So if we were collectively to put more time, capacity, resources, energy into really meaningfully building community power and encouraging and aiding communities to engage with their democracy, we might start to see institutions that better resemble those communities, but certainly deliver for them. And that is absolutely vital as we look at this road to democratic repair.
And that's not a dodge, actually. I think it's an important preamble, so it's not a dodge. So then I follow the bounce of your ball and say, if that were to be true, how would that community organizing translate into the exercise of policy or political power if you were king or queen for the day and got to design it?
And I think there's two possibilities there. One is, there's no argument, I think, that we don't need more devolution or more kind of power at a community level. I do personally think that's vital, and organising at its best starts at a local level. It builds connections between people who live in the same community, who see each other every day, and who know who their political representatives are. And right now that's hard in the UK because we have this very centralised democracy. So yes, some proper, meaningful devolution of power that communities can engage in and influence is really important. But the slightly bigger picture answer, I would say, is that if you look at that kind of terrible sort of doom-mongering we heard at the beginning and that we hear around us all of the time, if we look back in history, every time we've seen meaningful, major progress on an issue, be it women's rights, be it civil rights, LGBTQ rights, it's come from sustainable movements. Movements that have been based in the needs and wants of the community that is being disenfranchised or excluded, that are sustained by that community, but then able to build a base of solidarity and then force political action. So I think there's a bigger picture sort of meta point that is, yes, we need political reform so that communities can meaningfully win and engage, but we also need to be seeding those movements for change, because that is where we see the really big picture stuff that is going to take us out of this kind of doom-mongering into a more hopeful and possible future.
Mark, how do you build on that point? So you take community organizing, movements, devolution of power, and you start translating into the hallways of power that you have been in and inhabited. So in your prior life, if this theory worked, how would it change the way you operate? And then build on some of the specific ideas that you'd recommend.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this amazing conversation. I mean, look, I think that the starting point, and Martha's already sketched it, comes from an organization in the US called the Industrial Areas Foundation that I did some work with 20 years ago now. And they have a mantra which is that relationship precedes action always, which really goes to the heart of this point, which is you want big structural change, you want institutional change, we want new mechanisms of democracy. But in fact, we'll only get them if we make them, if we build them ourselves. And that requires collective action. And the precondition of collective action is actually people coming together across difference to build new coalitions for change. Now, that all sounds extraordinarily abstract when I say it like that. But, you know, I got a really sharp reminder of it, as you were saying, when I was in politics. So I worked for the British Labour Party between 2010 and 2015 with Ed Miliband as leader of the Labour Party. I adore Ed. I loved working with him then. But I will never forget that we would go places around the country to do speeches or events or press conferences. And everywhere you went, what became abundantly clear was that the politicians knew nobody on the ground. I mean, literally, once we were on a train going to Bristol, and Ed was on his phone ringing HQ saying, well, we're about to do a press conference on the minimum wage, so can I meet 10 minimum wage workers in Bristol before I talk to the press so I can get a feel for what life is like living on the minimum wage? And literally the voice from Labour HQ came back saying, we don't know anyone on the minimum wage in Bristol. You know, Bristol's one of Britain's biggest cities. It has a deep and profound Labour tradition. But the Labour Party, of all parties, had no connection on the ground with the people who actually experience life on the minimum wage. And so I always go back to that Industrial Areas Foundation starting point, which is if you're going to build change, you've got to build the relationships first. And that means our elite level politicians actually making a conscious and continual effort to rebuild their connections with the parts of the community that they hope to be able to represent.
So that's a problem if a Labour Party doesn't have that connection. But it assumes that the solution to that is they have better organizers. And if they had better organizers, would our problem be solved?
It wouldn't be solved overnight, but I think the key piece of memory is to say that change of the scale that we're talking about tonight to reach the problems that you were sketching at the start takes, unfortunately, even if we wish it not to, it takes years, if not decades, rather than months. And if we don't do that relational work because we're hoping for the quick solution, actually, we're never getting started on the process. And the best example of that, I always think, here in Britain, is a wonderful book that everyone should read if you haven't, called The Road to 1945 by Paul Addison, where Paul Addison pierces this myth that after the Second World War, we suddenly built a welfare state and the National Health Service. And he shows that it took detailed, careful, local efforts over all of the 1920s and all of the 1930s to create the pilot projects, the local examples that became the eventual beverage system and the National Health Service. And, you know, I think probably the thing that keeps me up at night most at the moment is that there are some examples like that now, but there aren't enough of them, and they're not effectively networked together, and we're not building those relationships with our political leaders.
So, Chris-Anne, when we were speaking, when I was prepping for this last night and I read that you had led a campaign that allowed migrants to access student finance through organizing, and you may articulate that better, but I found that to be an extraordinarily interesting endeavor, mostly because I think one of the problems with refugees and migrants is that they are perceived as liabilities when they are actually our largest assets. And one of the keys to them being an asset is giving them pathways to dignified lives, and student financing is one of them. So I'd like you to tell us how you got that done, because it's a case study in this theme of relationships and community organizing that we've just heard.
Thank you. So essentially, it came from a place of lived experience, being angry that I was also being barred from going to university with a student loan. But I think it speaks to the fact, who currently has power in society and what is the role of civil society in filling a gap, the democratic deficit left by the government, and also service provision. And I, like many young migrants, went to an organization asking for help. However, the power dynamics were very, very different. Instead of reinforcing some of the injustices that we were hoping to solve in the fact that the government had now created a new law that prevented 2,000 British-educated young migrants from going to university with student loan, they did that because they didn't consult with our communities, because our communities were seen as people that either they'd never met, never would be introduced to, and as a result, they wouldn't know about the impact. The main thing that a civil society organization I'm speaking about did was listen. There was a lot of deep work involved. So when I launched Let Us Learn, asking for equal access to higher education, and it essentially had to go through the courts. Before we got to the Supreme Court, there was a lot of community organizing on the ground. A lot of people, when they experience injustice, think that it's an isolated incident. So as a result, we started to host community gatherings, and that's when you will be able to hear about the pain and recognize it was systemic. The other thing I recognize as well is the role of those with lived experience being the main protagonist in the ask, right? So here we are, embedded in a adult-led organization, but we are young migrants. And they provided the conditions for us to do the activism. So they provided the infrastructure, including the finances, the building, the money for our travel while we went around, and we went to surgeries to speak about this with our local groups. But essentially, what was also interesting is that I'd be naive to say that lived experience in itself led to the policy win in the Supreme Court, because we had a systems change approach. We had those with lived experience, but we also had the lawyers, the litigators, the journalists who were carving out our message. There's a whole infrastructure that supported that community organizing that then led to the Supreme Court change. And our stories actually provided a big avenue, big thing for that, because what the justices didn't know is that this was a systemic issue. They thought it was an isolated issue, and we submitted testimony through an intervention.
So can I dig into, because firstly, there's nothing I love more than a story of successful grassroots organizing leading to systemic change, which is what you have achieved. Yes. That didn't take long. The question I have is you still were operating within a system in which you weren't dislodging the Supreme Court, right? That same Supreme Court can make rulings which strip British citizens of their citizenship because they're vaguely, Islamic thoughts, and leave them in Syrian camps in legal no man's lands, right? So you leveraged within an existing system, but did you change, and you got a law changed which created pathways to justice, but the system remained.
Yeah, and I think this is the binary that is problematic throughout when it comes to policy and systemic change. So there's the hostile environment in which we're operating in. Those rules were created as a result of them not wanting people without citizenship, even if they were brought up in the UK, to access a student loan. So of course there is that, and that system needs to be completely overhauled. But there's also the recognition that we were listening to our communities. We had to have an immediate result to the immediate problem that they were facing. There are 2,000 young migrants in this situation every year, all wanting to go to university. So I think there's something around incremental change, as well as changing the overall system, alleviating the immediate burdens, but also operating on a wider scale to get reform. So what I didn't mention is that post-2016, when that rule was changed, we gathered again, and our problems did not go away, because we were all on the 10-year route to citizenship, which was also introduced at the same time as that other rule. And we thought about the root causes of that. So, but for us being put on this 10-year route to citizenship, we wouldn't have to experience these legal limbos, for example, being told we can't get a student loan. And there wouldn't be so many gatekeepers having to prove our right to remain in the UK. So for the last 4 years, we've been campaigning against the 10-year route to settlement and reducing it to 5. And that also was an extension of what part would civil society play? Would it be a mediator speaking on behalf of communities? But but actually we created an organization that we just went to the politicians and spoke ourselves. So it's a restructuring of the dynamics and the power dynamics within an existing system that also then rearranges and also allows the hope and the inspiration for you to decide what is possible within the system while you are also tackling the overall image of it to break it down.
So, Indy, I mean, this is kind of a thin edge of the wedge theory of change, right? You find an area, you find a manifest injustice, you campaign around it, you get a win, and once you've got that win, a series of other wins become logical corollaries of the first win, and you continue to drive and to organize around it. And there's a long and noble history of winning massive change through this precise strategy. Based on our prior chat, I suspect I'd like to get you to kind of go one step outside the system a little bit and tell us some of your thoughts as to how we would begin to redesign the current system, and then we'll loop back in at the start to my right of how we design the mechanics of it.
Thank you. I suppose the method that we've talked about, I largely agree with. It's a very powerful method. I think where I have kind of focus on is what's the directionality? Where are we trying to get to? Democracy is not the vote. Let's just expand the theory of democracy first, because I think this has been a really limited idea, which is actually limiting us and limiting our theory of where intervention lies. Democracy, for me, is about the distribution of agency in society to make society. So markets are a subset of democracy if you get them right. They're a subset, not a superset. And we've kind of let markets and democracies go into opposition with each other, and most markets aren't markets, they're quasi-feudal systems of concentration of wealth. But if you bring the two together, you start to think about the stuff differently. And that's been a convenient exercise, because in some ways, everyone says, you keep complaining about democracy whilst we actually centralize and massively centralize the economic forces of the UK. 97% of money printed in the UK is printed by 4 banks. Money production, centralized. Treasury function, centralized in the Bank of England and the Treasury. How do you decentralize that? So we have to start to massively expand our theory of what are the institutions of agency in society. And without doing that, I think our kind of tinkering is literally just tinkering around replacing politicians. Because the Labour Party, even when they came in, were largely in hock of the same economic theory. They couldn't bypass the economic theory and the economic democracy that we're talking about. So I think there is a much more fundamental root cause that we have to get into. And then the second part of this conversation is democracy as we've currently envisaged it, and the idea of state, right? The UK as a red line bounded entity is no longer functional as an idea of governance in the world. If the UK was to save itself from climate change, go net zero, go pro-zero, we're all dead in the water, literally, if Nigeria and other places don't make the transition. So the first time in the world, we're living in a scale of planetary problems that exist and can only be delivered at a planetary scale, right? So is our industrial competitive theory of state, to which democracies have been orchestrated, even functional to get us out of not just, don't think climate change, think biodiversity loss, think plastic pollution, think nuclear weapons, think any of these planetary scale objects that exist. Our current democratic theory is not able to handle it. So I think this is much more of a structural reform of our theory of democracy. And we know, for example, our present, what I would call super minority-driven democracies, focused on present-day interest, is massively terminating future generations and also even young generations of our current age. So our democratic model needs to be understood as a capture model of super minorities focused on presentism. So if we reframe our democracy through that lens, we start to understand the scale of the gaps of reform. So this is not about fixing democracy, it's about expanding the whole scope of democracy in a much bigger sense. And that requires structural institutional reform. And it requires reform at the level, I think, of monetary production, property rights, liabilities. Who who owns the liabilities of carbon release from your land? Do you own them? So who owns the liabilities of these things? And when we start to understand this, we start to open up a whole new theory. Property has been massively centralized. What is it? 64% of the world's wealth is locked into property and land. 64%. 34% of it is all land. So you want to talk about democracy, we're talking about the fig leaf of agency, where actually land has become a wealth extraction system to extract from intangible and non-valuable goods. So we need to reimagine democracy, and that's my real push. I think we could talk about process, but what are we processing for? What is a process for? And I think we can connect to people, but without a vision of that expansion, I think it's meaningless. It's kind of, and that's why I think the right keep winning, by the way. I think that's why the right's narrative wins, because they tell more hard truths than I think the left try to do. And I think they constantly are telling, I mean, I'll give you the classic example to go on a little bit of a, like Trump sat in 2019 at the UN Center and was talking about how Germany would be ad hoc to the Russian gas systems in 2019, and the German ambassadors and the representative were laughing at him. I'm not an advocate of Trump by any means, but what I'm saying is, unless we start to have honest conversations of our vulnerabilities and our relationships, this all becomes nice, convenient, palliative care. My worry is, when does this conversation of democracy become palliative care to treat us as we die, rather than deeply reimagine our relationship with the planet, which is absolutely fucking necessary.
Okay. So now we're going to pivot into what when we were all before kind of pre-warned is specifics. And what I'm interested in is we now have a system that we agree fails. I go to a poll, they're parties, I look at people, I choose whether they like them or not, mostly on what party they belong to. If there's a particularly exceptional person or particularly odious person, I might switch. But basically, I choose on party preferences, and those people go into positions of power for the next 5 years and make fundamental decisions about my life. And I get 5 years later, there or thereabouts, an opportunity to tackle it again at a national level. I might have some other more devolved levels. And that's my experience of democracy. And small wonder, given the challenges we set out at the beginning, that is not working all that well. So if we're going to come back to the idea of civic organizing and organizing as an antidote to that, which I'm incredibly, as a person grew up in the anti-apartheid movement, incredibly politically sympathetic to, we solved the anti-apartheid movement, the end of apartheid, by putting in place exactly that system. And it didn't didn't do all that well for us. So what system specifically should we be putting in place that's better than that? Martha.
Nice, easy question there. I mean, reflecting on that question and some of those amazing interjections, I think there's probably 3 areas I would touch on. One, and this is actually part of a conversation that Mark and I and several others were having a few months ago around kind of our public services and our relationship with the state and how absent trust is in that relationship, and how we've ended up in this quite adversarial system where every time we interact with our government or with services, there's a kind of presumption of paternalism or a lack of trust that we're kind of normal adult human beings. And I think there's something around kind of major whole-scale reform is how do we build on the community power movement and that devolution of power to communities to really actually ask people what it is they want and build trusting relationships between the state and its citizens again. And that's not particularly specific, but I think that for me is one of the core tenets that's really missing. The second thing I pick up on, and Krisan said this, and it's the magical word power, that I think sometimes it's quite easy for community organizing to maybe be cast as this method that is a bit staid, or it focuses on that one win, or it doesn't change the system. But what I think Krisan hit the nail on the head with is if we actually start to build power at a local level or build the power of disenfranchised communities, it's through that awakening of power and agency that we actually start to shift the balance of our systems and our structures. And that, for me, I think is utterly critical if we look across civil society, and picking up on Mark's earlier point around where the NHS came from, that we've had in the UK previously an incredibly radical civil society, actually, that's been born out of the state kind of failing in its fundamental relationship to its citizens. And I think we've lost some of that. I think we too often have civil society that takes a lot of money from the state, that finds it hard because we actually have an increasingly challenging environment where it's difficult to campaign, it's difficult to be sort of meaningfully accountable to communities. So looking at that sense of how is it that we make civil society sort of genuinely radical and rooted again, so it can start to build that adjacent power that really does represent communities and shift the systems and structures by building that power and agency, is utterly crucial. And then the third area I'd look at a little bit is where is all the money coming from? And I would say that because we're a fund, so we're interested in how do we fund community organising. And there are so many big questions around, and I think actually Indy hit this nail on the head as well, around right versus left or progress versus anti-progress, that we've boxed ourselves into a corner often with where money comes from for social justice investments, that we want really specific results and really specific outcomes, and we focus on specific issues or themes. And what we miss is the opportunity for that big picture building of power and agency, where actually if we funded communities to do what they want, trusted them, built that power and those deep relationships over time, then we might finally start to have systems and structures that can really challenge some of this democratic decline and actually recast our version of democracy as we work towards a North Star. So not crazy specific, but 3 ideas about where we can take it from here.
Can I ask a sort of problematizing question from a position of fundamental friendship? Which is, the community organizing model I always associate with kind of people power movements, people who organize against stripping women of their reproductive rights, LGBTQ communities, people, Black Lives Matter. So I'm like, let's give those people more power. They need more power because they've been stripped from power and we have structural inequality. But for every one of those examples, you can have gun-toting Second Amendment fanatics. You can have evangelical groups designed to stop people expressing themselves on X, Y, and Z, right? You can have, and I confess my own political biases by even the way I formulate the question, but the idea that community organizing is progressive per se and drives forward human history. You can have people organizing for fox hunting or stopping wind power or all these things which, you know, might be anathema to us. So is there something per se good about community engagement?
I would still say yes, there is. And I think, I guess a few thoughts and considerations. One is at a purely very blunt level, yes, those people need more power. And actually we've been less effective at resourcing those communities than people who maybe want to slow the march of progress have been. And I think this was Indy's point. So bluntly, it's a tool that can be used by people of any persuasion. So let's get better at resourcing those who are fighting for progress and justice. But I also think organizing as a practice is so valuable, and Mark kind of gave us that definition earlier, is because it is rooted in relationships. It's rooted in genuinely meeting people where they are and not kind of casting aspersions. It's rooted in building community and building solidarity. And it is a practice that emerged from oppressed or marginalized communities demanding their rights. But they did that by listening and by building that wider solidarity. So I think if we look at organizing at its rawest level, it actually offers us this incredible tonic to this terribly polarized political debate and system that we're currently in, because it meets each of us where we are and really respects the human. So I would say bluntly, let's get more money into the hands of people who are fighting for justice, but also let's go back to the basics of organizing as something that can actually build bridges between communities. And I think if you look across like some of organizing's most effective outcomes or results, it's because they're able to engage with people of all political persuasions and all parties and governments of all colors.
Okay, so Mark, let's build on that then. Let's presume that you win and we have this really vibrant, dynamic, grassroots-oriented, block-by-block, devolved, organized citizens interfacing with power. And now we have the local councils of X, Y, and Z. Choose your lowest political unit. engaging with these informed, empowered citizen groups. Problem solved? Is that we just use the existing system and just organize at a grassroots level? Or I suspect Indy is kind of itching in his socks there going, no, 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 you've missed the paradigmatic point I spoke so passionately about. So tell us.
That's a great question. Look, so before I went into politics, I was a philosopher, so I always come at these questions in a slightly idiosyncratically philosophical way. But back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which was a similar period to this in the sense of people facing existential anxiety, threat, sort of huge challenges of the Industrial Revolution, of class conflict, of emerging in war between nations, there emerged a sort of straightforward cleavage in thinking between, on the one hand, those people who focus on what we call structure, which included Marx and the other Marxists and people like Emile Durkheim, who looked at the big problems and thought, well, these are massive problems and therefore they have to be tackled at a massive level. Only structural change is enough to actually bring anything about. And then on the other side, there were people like Max Weber, the German sociologist, who said, well, you might have identified big structural forces, but actually the only way that change happens in the world is through something that we've heard about tonight, which is agency. So it's individual people or groups of people actually using their power to try to bring about the first steps on a process which may then bring larger scale change if they happen to be successful and win. And as I mentioned earlier, that there's no shortcut to the structural phenomenon. And essentially the reason I keep in my mind going back to that 19th century argument is it seems to me spot on for us now, which is the structural forces that Indy has described so well are real, and those challenges are identifiable by social scientists or great book writers or people who do wonderful TED Talks. But actually the only way that any change happens is by people, including everyone in this room, doing things. Now, what it is they precisely do will depend upon where they are located and what potential opportunities they have for power. So what's available to Keir Starmer if he wins the election, or available to me as a community activist, remain different. But the only thing that we can actually do is build those connections, build those relationships, make the arguments, turn up at the meetings and knock on the doors. And none of that guarantees an outcome, but it is the necessary precondition for any good outcome. So it's definitely not game over as soon as you've got the vibrant civil society of which Martha's spoken so eloquently, but it is the necessary precondition. And my observation at the moment is we haven't got that yet. And so what we mustn't allow ourselves to do is get so excited by the structural story and what needs to happen and the TED Talks and the books that we're not doing the day-to-day, neighborhood-to-neighborhood, community-to-community, workplace-to-workplace organizing, because without that, nothing will change. And just to close on an anecdote which really hammered this home for me, because I learned everything I'm saying tonight really from, as I said, from the IAF in the US, and a wonderful man there called Arnie Graf, who worked with us in the Labour Party for a while under Ed's leadership. And I will always remember being walking with Arnie in a group of activists, and an activist came up to him and said, look, the problem, Arnie, with your community organizing style politics is, there are always some people who are left out, who aren't getting the change that they need. So we might get a pay rise for this group, but we're not getting a pay rise for that group, or this organizing is working here and it's not working there. And Arnie said, look, there are two things you need to know. You can be anxious and rightfully upset about that, but you've got to do something that you can actually do. And what you mustn't do is just go home and feel overwhelmed with the structural inequalities in the world and not make those first steps, which are the only steps which are actually available to us.
So Chris-Anne, I want to come to you on this point about agency versus structural change, because we keep toggling back and forth on this conversation, and appropriately so. To stop you having to relitigate, literally and metaphorically, every fight that you have to fight, what structural changes do you think we could design in the UK that deals with the rights of refugees and migrants in a way that gives you more permanent access to power rather than more contested access to power, one that you have to fight for rather than one that you have a seat at the table, as it were?
I think that that's actually come back to some of the things that Martha said, the beauty almost of community organising. For years we were organising around a specific issue. However, there's an empowerment that flows from that organising model and that process over time. It has a triple benefit to the individual, feeling more empowered in terms of using their agency and reconnecting with other people around them, going through the same thing, and then feeling empowered that collectively they can do something else. So it also has a community benefit. And the final thing, it has an issue benefit. You have more people speaking about a specific issue from the perspective of lived experience. And that goes beyond the actual campaign, right? It's forging relationships in a way that's deep. It's focusing on trauma healing. A lot of these communities have been historically excluded from bases of power. So if we can't have this at a top level, we can have it amongst our base, and there's power in numbers. But I think I wanted to also go back into to what Martha was saying about, we should get money in the hands of people doing this work. And obviously, I run a charity. We're part of the charity sector, civil society, but there is this danger of us. Someone said it recently at an event about the activism being professionalized and activism being commodified, which means that as a sector, we've been put forward what we had to erect basically in order to solve the direct needs of the communities that we are serving. So we have an amazing access to communities who rely on us for help. But I just remember when we were registering with the Charity Commission, they asked us to provide a business plan. And I thought that was so weird. We're not a company like that. We're just trying to be in the business of change making. But that allowed us to look long term. And what that forces charities to do is always have a growth model, which means that we want to exist for a long time. And we want to sustain our direct service provision. And the funding relationship almost promotes that as well. It's asking you, organizations, to respond to such chaos and such need and restructure systems with one-year grants. So they can't do the business of systems change and organizing and deep relationship building. They're forced to do the immediate work, and that's also problematic. It's problematic from the standpoint that if we think about who's brokering power relationships, that civil society has a massive part to play, but they simply don't have the time to do that deep listening. The other thing about it being professionalized as well is that there is a certain way to do things. There are certain people that can do policy change. They can speak in a certain way. There's a lingo behind it. So as a result, these communities that are impacted don't have the right language to articulate what they want. And I'm going to say this story just to show you how simple it also can be and how fun it can be. So back in 2016, after the Supreme Court challenge change, we had a new policy in place, and it allowed for more of us to go to university, myself included. However, there was a certain caveat that certain people couldn't reach in terms of eligibility. So that community organizing, that participation and that empowerment allowed us to regroup. And we said, okay, the policy change happened, but it didn't go far enough. So what could we do? So we were told by, we could go to vice chancellors of universities and ask for scholarships. If we went through the professionalized approach, we would write a number of letters and ask for meetings, and it would lead to nothing. So in 2017, we developed a campaign called Young, Gifted and Blocked. And you know what we did? We baked mince pies for these vice chancellors, and we sent it to them at Christmas, and we said, can we have a meeting? That led to 25 scholarships being created in 2017.
Amazing. So Indy stipulated that the state that emerged over the last 300 years is no longer fit for purpose. We still need to exist and govern and respond and show up and negotiate climate agreements and do all the boring stuff of statehood. But we also may need to, as you've suggested, radically reimagine some of these things. So give us some ideas of some transnational or subnational, more devolved, specific ideas around governance that you think would respond to the critique that I think everybody in this room agrees and that you perfectly articulated.
Thank you. I suppose one thing I just want to say is I wouldn't want to put into opposition structural change and community mobilizing. I think that's a problem. I think one is a means, and I think the other one is the target, in my view. And I think I want to embrace the two. Second, I want to say is that what I'm trying to get to is we are literally, if you look at 2070, the globe, in terms of actually temperature profiles around the world, most of the kind of landscapes from Middle Africa to India are basically uninhabitable. 2070. We're talking about 1.2 billion people on the move. When you take polls of when people look at the future, 92 to 95% of people now say climate change is a massive issue. So I don't want to, what I'm worried about is we keep saying, oh, we got to mobilize so Keir Starmer can make a fucking decision. Right? This is my point. Like, no, we're dying. Keir Starmer needs to make decisions and start to actually embrace a new political kind of landscape that's emerging. And I think this is what I'm finding slightly, we're in danger of saying, you guys mobilize a little bit more because I don't have the political Overton window that I perceive at the level of risk that we're holding. And I think that risk is now increasingly felt and known. And I think it's viscerally felt on the ground. I gave a talk at Link Road with Civic Square, and an 85-year-old gentleman walked up to me and sort of said, Indy, I didn't understand all the words, but you put words into what I was feeling. I think people can feel this discontinuity deep into their bones. So I want to preface that I worry that politicians are looking for a yes, but actually there is an ambient, conscious awareness of the scale of what's coming. So that's one thing. So that's kind of preamble. Here's 7 ideas. Literally, right?
You'll have to be quick.
Okay, I'm going to literally reel them out, right?
Go, go, go.
1, reimagine representation. The role of representation is not to represent you, but to represent public interest. We often drag politicians back to say, you did not represent me. No, they're not there to represent you. They're there to represent the public interest. Now, in that context, how do we make them accountable for that? There's a really interesting question. I was recently thinking, what would have happened if you took a minister to court in terms of failing their fiduciary duties with regards to a ministry? Like, I think we have to build systemic accountability of representation legally back into that and actually give greater freedom to politicians as a result of it. 2, we need to embrace the language of freedom. Freedom cannot be a theory of the right, a radical right. We have to talk about a freedom to care. The freedom to be not entrapped in a system, which is what our economic systems do, but actually a freedom to actually give a damn about each other. Re-embracing language and critical language is critical to opening up this landscape. 3, we need to build a distributed Bank of England. Bank of England needs to be taken and turned into a network Bank of England. The first time this could be done, massively improve devolution and the monetary capacity and the capacity for devolved regional innovation and leadership. 4, House of Lords need to be replaced by a House of 100 years, where by sortation people are invited to be in the House and their responsibility is to look at the 100-year future of Britain and evaluate policy on the implication of future generations. 5, we need to build Volk schools. So in Scandinavia, when Scandics were one of the poorest nations in the world, by the way, literally the poorest nations in the world in the 18th and 19th century. What they built were Volk schools. 10% of the population went to these schools for 6 months. And what they did was learn philosophy and skills together. Now what they've become is crappy polytechnics where you try to teach people skills because we don't believe people can actually become self-authoring. What they thought was actually people have to become self-authoring in their capability. So what is a new generation of human capability which actually builds self-authoring capacity of our citizenhood at scale? And we're going to have to do that if we're going to build that story. 6, we need to actually build universal basic services to actually de-instrumentalize people for a shitty economy. An economy which is effectively about instrumentalization of people and reduction of freedom, and build an economy which is based on intrinsic drivers, which is going to be fundamental for a craft, care, complex creativity economy. So if we're going to build the next economy of Britain, it won't be instrumentalized, it won't be command and controlled, because that's not the nature of the economy we're building. So how do we build the platform for that new economy? And 7, and I think it goes back to your point about community organizing. I think the biggest power of community organizing is de-othering society. De-othering. Politicians take their cues from shitty opinion polls, right? I've done this where you turn around and sort of have a conversation, say, who here likes universal basic income? I did this in Birmingham, in Oxford. 78% of people, when I asked them the question, said they thought universal basic income was a terrible idea. However, when they spent the day together with themselves, it was 80% thought it was a great idea. And it wasn't because we taught them anything new. It was because they thought, that guy with the beard, it's not that weird. And when you de-other people, people make different decisions about society. So my final recommendation is I think Keir Starmer should turn around and rebuild civic town halls across the UK as a re-emancipation of local democracy and build that as a symbol of a new democratic agreement and a compact with citizens and why that needs to be rebuilt, but also practically make that at the level of participation and participatory-driven democracy.
Fabulous. Thank you. So now that's a perfect segue into what Keir Starmer should do, but we do have a report which actually stipulates what he might do, written by Gordon Brown, which came out yesterday, so which today we're having a conversation, which is kind of spooky timing. So I'm going to ask any of you, but starting from Martha, to reflect, to the extent that you've, this may be an ambush, but to the extent that you've read the report, to just give a little, some of the best ideas in it and your general sense of where it is, because we're talking about reinventing government, and today we have a major report by the likely winner of the next election, if it were to held today, about how you would reimagine government. So how good a job did Gordon Brown do?
Well, I think it will come as no surprise to people in this room that we were excited by the proposals around devolving more power to communities. And it was good to see that written down and concrete recommendations around how the government might go about and do that. I also think there was a very, very strong focus on sort of quality and standards in public life, which definitely feels like it's lacking. And if you go out and you talk to communities, and I think this point about like actually having a conversation with how people are feeling, the mistrust and the distrust of our politicians runs so viscerally deep. And something has to happen in terms of communities actually feeling like they have agency and a say, but also who it is that's representing us and what are the pathways to bring communities into government so it's much more representative. And I think some of the recommendations there around really thinking through second jobs, standards, expectations of our politicians are vital. And a lot of the kind of polling and analysis that's been done around rebuilding trust really does centre in that space. So I think there's some good things in it. I think there's definitely, and we were talking about this just before we all came on, a sense of like what actually is the action and where do we start to really see kind of concrete, meaningful results. And again, like, not to consistently kind of bang that drum of community organising, but there is something about how do we get to a situation where our politicians don't just kind of ask for a bit of mobilisation to be given permission to do something radical, but that kind of deep radical change cannot be ignored because it's coming from the ground up. And I think those two in conversation is something that would be great to explore.
Mark, feel free to kind of just freestyle on my question, but also a kind of pre-nudge on this, which is the devolution question and the proportional representation question and how they link. Because one feels that you have clusters of people who are largely marginalized, who live in large cities. Westminster systems tend to disproportionately disfavor them. PR tends to re-empower them, but it also then moves the power into the hands of party mandarins and away from people on the ground. So can you square PR with Martha's, exhortation to devolution and citizen empowerment? And then any other thoughts on the report?
Yeah, no, that's, it's a really tricky question, I think. I mean, look, there are different mechanisms of PR and some of them will be better at dispersing power than others. And, one of the key things I think that this report gives us an opportunity to do is to look at the rest of the world and work out where vibrant democracies exist and where they don't. I've just come back, as you mentioned at the start, from 5 years in Australia, and I went as a skeptic of the Australian PR system and a skeptic about compulsory voting, and in some ways I've come back less skeptical. I mean, I think the Australian election we just saw was a really good demonstration of how independent voices are able to be heard when you have some kind of proportionality into the system. And also compulsory voting meant that the sort of capture by populist forces, far-right forces, is much harder in Australia than it is elsewhere. So some of these structural changes, I think there are good examples in the rest of the world that we could learn from. I think the report overall is more exciting for what it makes possible than what it actually sets out right at this moment, which is we do have a leader of the Labour Party now saying power ought to reside in the hands of more people, that currently power resides in the hands of the few. There ought to be a significant structural transformation of that so that ordinary voters, everyday citizens, have the opportunity to exercise much more say about their lives. I think it's terrific to have a leader of a major political party say that. And then you'll be unsurprised to learn that my view is that it therefore falls on the rest of us in the next 2 years actually to flesh out the detail. The report doesn't do that, and Starmer has been quite clear that the report is the beginning of a process and not the end. So I would love to see a kind of vibrant civil society response, which is, okay, let's take the leader of the Labour Party at his word. We want a distribution of power. We want more equitable voices in British politics. And let's collectively come up with 20, 30, 40, 50 proposals, which we then go to the Labour Party and emphasise and stress. And if I may, that just takes me to a final thought, which is that I guess I'm probably the least anti-politician person perhaps on the panel, maybe even in the room, having spent 5 years working side by side with one who I really like. And I think there is a glimmer of hope here, which is that our politicians have let us down on all sides. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They aren't up to the challenge that we've said. But we do still live in a democracy where we can still make our voices heard. And, the best thing I did this year, bizarrely enough, and again, you'll think I'm strange, but, I went to both party conferences, to the Labour Party conference and the Conservative Party conference, having been out of the country for 5 years. And you can just turn up. You just buy yourself a ticket or get your organisation to buy a ticket, and you turn up. And for 4 or 5 days, you're there, cheek by jowl, with the people who are either leading the country or who are aspiring to lead the country. And of course they listen to some people more than they listen to others, and the people with the big checkbooks get more face time with them, and of course there are all kinds of injustices. But it is kind of amazing that we still live in a society where those people who govern us are subject to our will and where we can make our voices heard. And that, I think, is the kind of biggest theme that I really want to emphasise tonight, is with a report like this, let's not just take it as, tablets of stone coming on high, but let's take it as an invitation for the rest of us to make our voices heard and to say what it is that we expect and demand of our political class.
Chrisanne, I want to ask you a question which links into the nature of this report, but an area of work that you've achieved incredible success in. I think one of the problems with the question of refugees and migrants is that people sit outside the polity and don't have a voice at the table and don't have the power of the vote. It so happens that you will never solve the demographic time bomb that modern wealthy democracies are facing unless you allow more porous borders. And you will never avert the xenophobic demagoguery that's going to come from people crossing borders due to conflict in climate zone unless you change the way that refugees and migrants are perceived and can function in countries that they move to. So if there was ever a group of people who you would want to be empowered for the sake of wealthy democracies, not despite the fact that people are here and are kind of a nasty affair accompli, but for the sake of them, it would be this group. And yet, we don't create structural mechanisms to give them a voice. So if you were at the table and you were writing Gordon Brown's note and you said, how do you give the disempowered a structural voice in a society that doesn't legally entitle them to have a structural voice? What would you do? What would you want people to have?
So that's a big one. I think there is this thing, though, even though we've been working really hard, now we have monthly meetings with civil servants in the Home Office. And by the way, they don't know what Clause 9 of Appendix FM means. They're not well versed in their own policy. So it becomes a educating of them on the impacts of the system. So one of the things I would say is that those in power need to have direct access to communities and commit to long-term intentional relationship building with the aim of fixing things that are problematic within the refugee and migrant sector. And that's normally not the case, because there is the people being helped versus the experts that then bring them along. But one of the things that I'm still uncomfortable with is that even though we've created that avenue and that platform for us to directly have these meetings with civil servants, there is this element of lack of trust in terms of what we're bringing to the table. So I could say there is a problem with X. In order for me to prove that there's a problem with X, I need to go back and find case studies. And that forces me to have a bit of extraction from my community. So this idea that unless there are a lot of numbers to prove it, it can be ignored despite that channel of communication. The GLA did numbers research which showed that there are over 330,000 children and young people born in the UK or brought here at a young age who have precarious status. After we got that number, by the way, we've been campaigning 2 years prior, they were like, how big is this issue? What's the scale of this issue? We got them the number, they didn't change it. So there's this idea that we're constantly doing what they're asking us to do, but unless there's a political will to do it, that would not be the case. The other thing I also recognize is that in terms of categories, we belong primarily focused on young people who migrated here as children. Social integration is a big thing for the Conservative Party. Self-sufficiency is a big thing. We've had to make concessions in terms of the way in which we communicate with them. It's not a them or us. We don't believe in categories or this good migrant, bad migrant. However, it's the language used by the government that sometimes you have to opt into in order to get the change. So even if there are avenues for us to have direct contact and be represented in those spaces, there's a political will to do it, and also the concessions that bring discomfort along the change-making journey.
So we're going to turn over to the audience, but I'm going to ask India a sort of final specific questions on one of your 7, because I think it does point to some of the constitutional complexities of operationalizing some of your good ideas. And I'm going to ask you this because I know you've probably have a quick, easy solve for it, but the 100-year house idea I am instinctually drawn to because of the short-termism and the hard things we have to do, particularly in economic equality and climate. We need to think in long terms. But if you've had a prior 100 years in which power has slowly drained away from the bottom of society into a small group of hands, and you then say to people, we need to make long-term difficult investments because we can't get quick fixes. And a group of people say, I've been on the side of injustice for so long, I need quick fixes. And the 100-year house becomes a brake on quick fixes because it wants to take the long investments. Is there not a challenge between the immediacy of democratic theory and the broader things we need to get done?
Yes. I think if you communicate this right, people get it. We're almost certainly a sacrificial generation, right? In terms of actually, if you look at pay, if you look at carbon, it was all extracted by sort of kind of the baby boomers in terms of wealth, quality of life, all of that stuff. I think there's an honesty that people can appreciate if you say, look, it's going to be a hard 40 years. Pretty much the next 40 years is going to be really difficult. We do not have the replacement for 500 billion human unit worths of energy of hydrocarbon that an 8 billion civilization lives off. We don't have the material resources to build the renewables energy that we're talking about. We don't have the copper mines. So, my problem is that we're telling people lies and then allowing failure to happen, rather than embracing the scale of what's coming and inviting people to be on a journey to, I think, an incredible possibility. In 40 years, you could be looking at near infinite energy, near infinite material uses, and we have to look forward. But that requires us as a generation to work through a transition. And I think the honesty of that is more likely to engage it, whereas I think what we're currently doing is we're being disingenuous, and this is where the far right is winning constantly. We're saying it's going to be all right, we're going to solve your social issues. We're not. We don't have the material resources to solve retrofit across the UK. Right? So I think the honesty firstly, and then what is the equity in that honesty, and then recognizing the injustices. I think this transition requires a peace and reconciliation of many, many people across Britain and internationally who we've been party to in harm. So if I was anywhere close to Keir Starmer, I'd be talking about actually building a new peace and reconciliation of Britain inside and outside and trying to step forward. We have to recognize it and move forward. I don't think I think people can get that.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there'll be absolutely no questions from this audience at all, given the richness of this conversation is all resolved. Questions?
Can you hear me? It's Richard Perry, powered by change. My favourite buzzword at the moment is re-evolution, because it sounds like revolution, but it doesn't get picked up on the internet. But yeah, so I think the way, because you've used words like elite, I just wrote down, I think the language you're using, we're still living in the box that we're stuck in, so we do need something quite radical. So I think the way to not distribute power, we are the power, so the way to give us the power, as in the population, is to, I'll just give you an example, because I could talk all night, but I won't.
It's going to be a question.
The question is, what about things like mutual, everyone knows the John Lewis model. Why don't we just deploy things that we already have? So I'm in private equity. Why can't I buy a company, let the employees own it as well, so it becomes a mutual, and therefore we don't nationalise or privatise, we just democratise it. So you can apply that to any business or organisation. So why don't we do things like that if you want some real change?
I'm going to take 3 questions and then you, sir. Yes, take a mic, yeah.
So my question is around how we take this conversation from this very rarefied room to voters, because we've had you've had a very complex discussion about theories and ideas, but none of that really sounds that appealing to voters, especially what you said, Indy, about the next 40 years being difficult and it's basically going to be shit until the middle of the century. That might be true, but no one's going to vote for that. So how is it that we actually take this conversation and make it appealing to voters? Because it's not appealing to me.
Okay. There's one at the back. Yep.
Great discussion, but if I hadn't known the title of the discussion in advance, I might have thought it was, how do we best structure society to achieve left-wing outcomes? So how do you pitch this to right-wing audiences? 44% of the country voted Tory at the last election. You're going to need them on board if you're going to take them on this journey.
There's 3 bracing questions. Over to you.
I mean, I'm in danger of saying community organising is always the answer. But I think as a kind of co-convener, that's my prerogative. I guess I would say 2 points. I think for me, community organising, it's not about selling organising to voters. It's actually about moving democracy beyond one transactional vote. And that kind of mirrors what Indy was saying, that true civic power or community power is citizens having the capacity to engage day in, day out with their democracy, with their politicians, with the things that affect their life. And I think that if we invest more in community organising, and in particularly grassroots community organising, and respond to the amazing, rich, incredible work that is happening in communities all across the country, a lot of which really was evidenced by COVID, when communities came together and supported one another and had their own answers to these horrible, big, meaty issues, that's when we actually start to make a democracy that speaks to those voters and responds to those voters. And I think to take the question at the back, like, yes, there's a justice element to all of this. I don't think justice is a left-wing issue. I think it's a question of, again, to Indy's point, freedom. And we can't truly be free if many communities don't have the right to really exercise their voice or have their voices or their concerns heard. But equally, it shouldn't be partisan, and organising isn't partisan, to go down to that lowest level and just say to people, what is it that you want, and how do we build power in order to win that? So I think having that conversation around organising being rooted in what communities actually want, and providing them, in the words of Ernesto Cortes Jr., another Industrial Areas Foundation quote, organising as a practice, it makes our institutions relevant. It gives communities hope, and most of all, it builds the power to actually change things. And ultimately, that's all we're talking about. And that shouldn't be complex, and it shouldn't be left-wing, and it can be radical.
Okay, Mr. Speechwriter. Come on, Mr. Speechwriter, make this palatable for voters.
Look, I don't actually think it's that difficult, if I'm totally honest. And I think Keir Starmer did a pretty decent job this year in his conference speech, which probably most people missed. But I think the fundamental drive in British politics on both right and left at the moment is that we live in a very pessimistic age. People do not think that the future will be better than the past. And that is shared across ideological persuasions, it's shared across demographic groups, different generational groups. We are living at a particular moment in time where people are deeply anxious, either about climate for the reasons that India has described, or about the economy. People know that the cost of living pressures of the moment aren't a temporary result of Putin's terrible war in Ukraine. They're a fundamental feature of the nature of our economic system. And they also know, and I think this trumps almost everything, that that's at least in part a function that people like them don't matter as much as they used to. There is a deep realization that politicians used to attend to our concerns in a way that they have got away with not doing over the last 10, 15, 20 years. That has generated populism, it generated UKIP, it generated Brexit, it generated Jeremy Corbyn. The challenge to mainstream politicians now, the Rishi Sunaks or the Keir Starmers of the world, is to articulate that they have a real response to that sensation, which all of the decent opinion polling, all of the focus groups, all of the ethnography reveals very straightforwardly. Look, there are some people in London doing very well right now. They're in creative industries, they're in financial services, the values of their properties are still going up, the values of their incomes are still going up. It's not true for 75 or 80% of the British population. They need to be able to hear that the parties are attendant to those issues and are up to the challenge of doing something about it, but don't have any straightforward or easy solutions which are going to magic it all away. Now, that's what I would be writing if I were still a speechwriter for either of the two major parties. I think it's actually already there. It was there in Boris Johnson's promise of levelling up. It was there in Nigel Farage's promise of Brexit. As I said, it's there in this year's Keir Starmer speech when he talks about us needing to find our future again. It just hasn't quite yet got the sort of raw energy that I would like to see it have in our mainstream politics. And then to segue quickly to the first question, look, what we should be doing, I think, is exactly the bold experiments of the kind that you described, the mutualisation, the democratising the firm. But we don't need to wait to win an election to do that. And that was the message of the 1920s and 30s. Like, do it now, experiment, see what works, and then the political parties will come. Because after all, they're really in the game of giving us the stuff which is going to turn these things around.
Chrisanne?
Yes. But to the gentleman who spoke about, all this doom and gloom, how does that translate to actual participation, people wanting to do something about it? And I think just have to accept that some people won't do anything about it because there is no, our communities are very deeply hurt and some people just choose to opt out. So no matter the messaging, the narrative, some people just choose not to participate, and that's their own protective mechanism. I will just operate in my silo. Obviously, that's not very good for what we're trying to achieve, but that's something we just have to accept. There's also the recognition that everyone promotes it, collaboration and partnership. The idea is that, as if we're all on the same page. We are not. That's one within our said community. If I gather 25 of our young people here, some of them are left-leaning, some of them are right-leaning. That is okay. We have to accommodate for different points of views, and there's beauty in difference. But there is something around the granular, which I'll go back to, which is sometimes the bigger picture is scary. So it's easier at times to galvanize people around a specific action, a specific call to action that has a tangible result and impact immediately on them. That doesn't mean that the big blue sky thinking can't happen at the same time, but you have to get people along that way with doing something. And just briefly as well in the back, what the gentleman said about you think that we're all operating. We think, based upon the panel discussion, that we would assume that justice and equality are only liberal, left qualities, and people only on the left accept those things. And I think that that's a massive problem within the charity sector. We make assumptions about what the other side thinks, and so that then prevents us from developing relationships. To put in a nutshell, the immigration change that we've just gotten, shortening the 10-year route to 5, it happened under a Conservative government, which is the most hostile of all time. But it happened because we left our politics at the door with civil servants, and we were operating on values such as aspiration, the social contract being repaired, with communities engaging with the Home Office post-Windrush. So there's something around addressing the assumptions that we have in the field and recognizing that whoever is in power, there's some basic structures that need to be put in place, and also respecting of difference. Even if I don't like you, we can agree on certain things.
Indy, before we stepped up here, we spoke about the left-right question, and you had I thought, a persuasive argument, so go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems, is we often think of change through a statist lens. And I think the state is not the only actor of change. And I increasingly think the state is, by this monolithic idea of the state, may even be a structural problem. And I think we have to think much deeper about democracy, not through, like I said, the vote, but the democratization of agency. At that moment in time, I think there's a different conversation between the left and the right. In fact, the democratization of agency for me becomes about a new theory of freedom, a freedom in which we exist in care with each other. So I do think there's a new narrative line that can be drawn between those two positions, which I think is far more interesting than a kind of state will solve this or the market would solve this kind of classical narrative that we've been locked into. So I would argue that this panel conversation isn't about that, but it's actually a new way. I do want to actually engage the kind of the conversation about cooperative ownership. I think that's great, really do. However, 2 caveats. One, we're almost certainly looking at an economic Armageddon event for our existing economy. So 64% of our economy, if it priced in social environmental goods, is non-viable. So let's make sure we're not handing over pups to our communities. Second, actually cooperativism is great, but cooperativism, like the Mondragon cooperative, is brilliant. But when it operates in India, it operates with the same theory of extraction as McKinsey. So cooperativism creates the same theory of in and out groups. And I think one of the biggest challenges for our economy is operating in a theory of entanglement where there is no in and out group. And how do you operate in that? So I think there's a really interesting question about the nature of the firm in the 21st century in a theory of entanglement. And I think that would be really powerful to do. And I do think that's on the table. I think one final point around the kind of negativism. What I worry about more is the false positivism, actually. I worry about the false positivism as a narrative, which I think we've been locked into, certainly from the progressive left, kind of masking the world with a kind of, we can do this, let's all have hope, without recognizing the depth of the challenge. And I think we can have hope if we recognize the depth of the challenge. The depth of the challenge is not there to scare us, but to invite us to be bigger. That is the invitation. And I think we have to see the scale of the challenge as an invitation, not an invitation to scare. And I think that's what history has taught us. There's extraordinary events that have happened in history that we've done at scale with the invitation to be bigger. And I think that's where the moment is.
Final set of questions, or yes? Two final. There we go. I'm going to try and make sure we have women.
Well, this was
a
gender question. It was actually a gender question.
I'm not holding your gender against you, so go ahead.
No, it was a question about women, actually.
Good. You being an advocate, an ally.
No, sorry, yeah. So my background's in community organising and small charities, which is female-led action, small scale. And just lurking in all of this did seem to be a gender question when India talked about the sort of compassionate side of the economy. And actually, I personally think the mispricing of unpaid labour and the inability to react as that workforce changes because you've mispriced that in the first place. That's a different subject. But it was really to invite the panel to talk about gender and say, where do you see gender in this whole conversation? And that's all my question got to in the end. So.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much for giving the talk. I found it really engaging and really appreciated everything everyone had to say. I kind of wanted to know, like, these messages that we're discussing, like, what is the role of the media in actually deploying them to the public? Because we can keep them in this room, politicians can have them amongst themselves. Not everyone's going to read the report that's come out from Gordon Brown. So, like, what is the role in kind of allowing them to retain this myth of objectivity whilst also kind of setting a new agenda and kind of framing these issues that we've discussed, like climate change, and making them front and center without also kind of seeming as though it's like something that's like radical when it's actually very necessary?
Great, thank you. And last question.
Thank you for an inspiring talk. I wholeheartedly agree that the best way is to fund grassroots movements, but I still think there's a real risk that it won't feed up high up the food chain to policy makers, and that's what we really need to effectuate change. And I suppose my question is around influence. I know we've talked about structural reform already, but I just wondered if you've got any thoughts on how to influence policymakers at a larger scale.
Okay, lightning round, crisp, concise, final message, win them over. Chris Ann.
Well, I'm not going to answer the gender one because I'm a woman and I think someone else should. But the one that was just asked about, I think there's an important question about the role of allies. Communities that are historically disadvantaged don't have access to the socio-economic power and access to networks that someone who isn't from a disadvantaged background may have. And I think this is the important thing about systems change, intentional roles given to different people in order to forge those connections. So there is something around what networks do you have and are you willing to share them? What seat are you currently sitting in and are you willing to give it up? In the quest to kind of transform society and share power with those who are historically disadvantaged. That was short.
And powerful. Mark.
Also hard. On the gender challenge is banging at the door. It's a disempowered voice, sorry. On the gender issue, I wish I could have more to say, but the one thing which I am really inspired about right now is what's happening in Australia. So I went through, I was saying this to some of our fellow panelists at the start, I was really I was in Australia for 5 years. I was really gloomy during the election because Anthony Albanese, the Labour leader, played it very safe, very boring, didn't say anything. It was called the small target strategy. The whole idea was to give no hostage to fortune. But then on becoming Prime Minister, he has actually done an astonishing job in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways goes straight to this gender issue, which is that Albanese has now said there are two problems in Australian society on the economic side. One is that wages are very depressed and have been for a significant period of time. And the other is that there are all kinds of jobs, especially in the caring sector, which are not being properly rewarded, haven't been invested in, and their contribution to the economy has not been properly recognised either by the market or by the state. And then Albanese said, and at the intersection of those two challenges is gender. And actually, if you begin to look at whose wages have been most repressed, it's women. And if you look at the people who are providing most of those jobs in sectors of the economy which have been undervalued, it's women. And there has been a remarkable effort on behalf of the Australian Labor government to do something about that through the extension of collective bargaining rights. I can talk about that in more detail over drinks, but it's a strategy to involve women-led trade unions in overcoming these entrenched structural injustices within the labour market. And the reason that gives me hope is multiple, but primarily because where it looked as if it was dull and that nothing was going to happen, something quite remarkable is happening. And the reason it's happening is because there were people banging on Anthony Albanese's door before the election, during the election, and after the election to make sure that that issue was front and centre of his legislative agenda. And those were largely female-led, economically oriented, mobilising forces. So that gives me some room for optimism. And anything that we can do, for example, my organisation coming back from the Allies point, to support those organisations to articulate their case, to research it properly, to build the connections, that's what organisations like mine ought to be doing.
Indy.
The media question, I think the kind of most obvious question is ownership of media. And I think, we can sort of mess around with everything else, but the reality is UK has been unduly influenced by offshore systems. And if UK wants to have sovereignty of voice, you have to kind of change the ownership of the media system. And that's kind of straightforward. It's just about sovereignty. It's about whether we are narrating our own stories or whether we're being biased by third-party systems around the world and manipulated. That's how you frame it, and that's how you kill it. And I think it needs to be genuinely taken out. And actually, we have to sort out media ownership. That's the only way we move forward.
Martha, you're going to have the last word, but also I wanted to, before you have the last word, thank you so much for your role in organizing this and for your general work in, this is a embodiment, believe it or not, of civic engagement. So to thank you for that and to hand over the mic to you.
Well, thank you very much, and huge thanks to you and the Conduit for allowing us to convene this event and bring it together, and to all of you for showing up and engaging, and to the wonderful panel. And I think it's really difficult to know how to end because there are so many buzzing thoughts. But I will say I really agree with what Chris Ann said around allies. And there's an organizer in the US called Jay McLeavy. Many of you will know her, and she has a famous line that the only power ordinary people have is numbers. And that's the thing that gives me hope that actually we can make structural change, we can fix UK democracy, because we're here in this room, we're having this conversation 100 times over in communities up and down the country. There is will, and if we come together and we demand better, I think we can achieve some real change. So thank you.
And I'm just moved by that because I'm going to reflect on one moment in 1989 and 1990 in South Africa, sitting in rooms where you had a state that was assassinating, torturing people, abducting people, when nobody thought Nelson Mandela was still in prison. And I remember sitting in a room in a meeting of the United Democratic Front, which was an anti-apartheid movement, which had in the room trade unions, women's groups, youth groups, sporting groups, cultural groups, librarians, for God's sake. It had every stripe of every person opposed to apartheid in an umbrella organization which said, how are we going to systematically take down and attack the system of injustice and replace it with something else so that when we win at a negotiating table, we translate our demands into a constitution. And South Africa has a constitution which is one of the most brilliant, progressive, interesting constitutions in the world, which has withstood a lot of human imperfection, quite frankly, but it's because ordinary people translated their struggles against an evil system into a better and more enduring and more just system. And that translation, your story about Australia, your stories about refugees, your stories about reimagining houses, your stories about what civic empowerment does, is the embodiment of that, and that is what gives us agency and hope, and why I'm so incredibly grateful for this panel and for you all showing up. We're going to have drinks on the third floor. Is that where we're going to have drinks, Rosie? Yes. So what usually happens now is the panel stands here, people come up to them and speak to them. They get trapped here for about 25 minutes, and then people go home, which is really sad. So I'm going to abduct them up the back to the third floor. If you want to talk to them, you have to go to the third floor. And then we'll have a fun time up there. So thanks so much.